Hey guys, I wanted to share with you a game that I played today. I only had a short amount of time, so I went on to look at open challenges that I should be able to complete within 10 minutes. So there I'm looking for a maximum of 5-minute blitz game. And I was paired against Bob455, who's rated 1921, which is the highest rated player I've ever come up against, and I thought it would be good to share the game with you. The first 9 moves were absolutely rattled out, and if you do find yourself playing blitz, which is not what I recommend, but the reason we're looking at this game is that it's a good game and completed within 5 minutes. If you do find yourself playing blitz, then one of the things that can really help is to have an opening where you can knock out the first few moves without too much thought, and that's what's going on here. So he's opened with e4, and I'm playing the black lion defense, which tends to be quite closed, but one of the advantages is that the first 10 or 11 moves are quite often always the same, and you know, this has been tried numerous times by different people, and generally white's responses to what black does tend to follow a fairly familiar pattern most of the time. There are obviously always variations. I'm playing a fairly high rated player, or very high rated for me. So black's first move here is d6, white replies with d3, knight comes out, knight comes out, knight comes out. Then pawn to g3, so that's preparing the fianchetto for the bishop, I would imagine, on g2 here. I play e5, which is the next move. I'm always happy if I can get that in. There goes the bishop fianchetto. Nice thing about a fianchettoed bishop is that obviously it controls a nice long diagonal across the board. The downside in this position is that he's got, obviously one of his own pawns is in the way. So I've played my bishop in. These are all standard moves for me, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Pawn goes there, allowing the queen to go to c7. White castles, I go to c7. White then pushes h3, which I'm not quite sure of the point of that move, other than obviously it prevents my knight from being able to jump into g4. Maybe that's the idea. I'll then play h7, preparing for g5. And now the pawn break, f2 to f4, comes in, which is definitely quite sharp. It's opening up the game. So we're thinking about our principles. Taking your time, which we haven't done in these first moves. These moves have been absolutely rattled out, but hey, we've got 5 minutes. This isn't what I would recommend to improve your skill and improve your results, but it's appropriate in this kind of situation. So, number 1, taking your time. Number 2, king safety. Number 3, controlling the board. Now, in terms of control of the board, let's start to colour in the board, and let's have a think about, particularly in the middle of the board, how many squares does white control? Okay, so I'm going to these pawns controlling that, knight is controlling that, pawn there, and these 3 are all controlled, and pretty much every other square is controlled by something. Okay, so the king, yeah. So that's all controlled. So apart from the squares that white's own pieces are on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 16 squares. Right, now let's do the same for black. Okay, so we've got one there, one there. That one is not controlled. Oops. That one is by the knight. That one is not. That one is. Now, what I'm doing here, this is something that you can kind of do in your own head to a degree. And that one is controlled by the knight. You know, it's a good idea to start to get into the habit of looking at the board and saying, how much of the board am I controlling? You don't have to count the squares necessarily. So how many have we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So what we know is that white, I think, is controlling a bit more of the board at this point. And that's why I say that this black line defense, I think particularly if we look at it, the pawns aren't as advanced as white's. You know, white's got 2 pawns on the 4th rank. I've only got 1 that's that far up. So it means I've got a little bit less space to play with, maybe. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns that are off the back line. I've got 4 pawns off the back line, although it is my go. And I've got my knights here. This bishop is doing very, very little. Okay, and obviously this bishop is doing nothing at all at this point. It's undeveloped. Okay, but this is the process that I want us to start thinking about. How much of the board is under my control? Okay, so the next move, I play g5 anyway, although that pawn has come up. I'm figuring that, you know, a few exchanges around here can't be a bad thing because his king is over there, right? My king is currently a little bit out of the way and I have the option still to castle queenside. So let's see what happens. White plays in the knight. And let's see, why did I move my knight back there? Okay, so what we've got now is we've got 1 pawn and the knight and this bishop all looking at this pawn here on g5, right? And now my pawn is currently only defended once by its buddy there on h6, but I figured that if I moved the knight here to h7, then the knight and the bishop on e7 is now going to defend that pawn. So he's got 3 attackers, I've got 3 defenders. So what would happen in that situation? He takes, I recapture. He takes, I recapture. He takes, I recapture. It ends up even. Okay? So what happens? He does take. I recapture with the knight. He takes back with the knight and I recapture with the bishop. So I'm noticing his pawns are on light squares. He's got this main pawn chain on the light squares there, which means that, as we've seen, his light square bishop has got very little to do. It's not looking at much of the board right now because of that pawn on e4. Whereas the dark square bishop has much more of the board in his sights. So I figure an exchange there wouldn't be bad. White agrees, and we exchange there on g5. Brings his queen forward, they're connecting his rooks, completing development. I play f6 to defend my forward pawns. He plays f2. Now, you always have to think, what is my opponent's plan? What is his idea? Why did he just play that move? Clearly, I think he's going to think about doubling up his rooks on the f-file and launching an attack down here towards my king. So, although my knight was the only piece defending that pawn, and I'm not quite sure what I was thinking here. How long did I think about that move? Knight f8. I thought for 10 seconds about it, and I still left a piece undefended, which is weird. Even though it's the piece that I just moved to defend my other pawns, I just took my eye off it, you know, and white wastes no time in jumping in and snatching the pawn, which he does in 1.8 seconds. Okay. I move my queen across to threaten the rook and to defend both of those forward pawns, the g pawn now being isolated, and his queen can actually come in and take that. White backs up his attacking rook with his other rook, which is a very good idea, both rooks on the same file, all good. I bring out my bishop so that I can castle my king and get him to safety. The queen indeed does come in and snatch the loose pawn on g5. So it's starting to look a bit hairy at this point. I go ahead and castle. White retreats the queen back to e3, clearly eyeing up the loose undefended pawn on a7. I'm not too worried about that, so I'm going to move my rook in to attack the... Sorry, my knight moves in to attack his rook and also reconnecting my rooks. He moves his rook back, And I spot here that the pawn on h3 is defended just by the one bishop right now, whereas I've got my light squared bishop and my rook on it. Another thing I could have thought about is maybe taking the pawn here, but this is a very common mistake, because what very often happens then is the player has just had his pawn taken, can push this one forward as long as it's defended, and that bishop is now trapped. So that's happened more than once. So I go in and capture on h3. White here decides not to enter the exchange, but instead to come in and attack my queen. Obviously the rook is defended by his buddy, but it's not too dangerous a situation. I'm quite happy on the back rank. White can't attack the back rank with a pair of rooks, because if he does, he moves a rook, I capture, he captures, I capture, so I've still got a rook on the board and he hasn't, so he would lose that exchange. Okay, so I just move my queen out of the way, also attacking that pawn on a2 and defending my bishop on h3. It's always nice when you can play a move that achieves more than one thing. The queen dives in and captures on a7. I go ahead and take the bishop. The queen comes in. I know that my king is relatively safe. Then we enter a little bit of a tussle here. So I have to think carefully. Move down, he comes back down. Now if we'd done that maybe one more time, the game could have ended in a draw, which would have been pretty good for me. I think I'd have got 8 points anyway, because there was such a great difference in rating. But instead of that, when he moves his queen back to a5, I decide I can push my pawn, because if he brings his queen here, I can put my king there, and I think we're okay. So that's how it works out. He comes in with a queen. My king does have one square. This knight is defended twice, so that's not an issue. And then White has pretty much done the same calculation as I have and figures out that there's no point just repetitively doing that same move with the queen. So he goes ahead and recaptures the bishop, at which point I see an advantage, an opportunity. So I'll dive in with the queen. King moves out the way, queen moves in. King then moves back to e1. So the king's now running off. I can't take this pawn here because it's defended by the knight. My king can't move at all. And there's a very serious risk of, is there? Can he take that knight? No, if he takes the knight, then my rook captures, but then his queen could come back to like a8. My king would have to move out the way, and oh no, my rook's defended by that. So it's not, I'd have to consider king safety at this end of the board, but sometimes, very often there's a balancing act. You know, when you go into an attack, when you get into a sharp position where both sides are able to attack each other at the same time, you really have to sometimes think carefully about, if I launch this attack now and leave my own defences vulnerable, can I make my attack good? Can I complete it? Can I actually win the game or get a significant advantage without losing the game at the other end by getting checkmated myself? So I decide to move my queen out of the way so that I can bring my rook into h1, which would almost certainly prompt an exchange, because I would then be threatening to capture with the queen. That would be check, and then over here check again, and I'm all over this king. So that's my idea. White now moves the queen back up to a4 with ideas of coming in here and capturing that pawn, which would be very unpleasant. So I move my king up to c7, and the queen now moves across. This was a move I didn't quite understand. Didn't quite see the point of this particular one, but my opponent is much smarter than me, so we'll let that one slide. We'll leave it open. Rook comes in. Okay, now the queen is coming into e6, but the queen still can't capture the knight, because the rook would just take and still be defended. and can't capture the pawn because the king's defending the pawn. So I'm not very clear what the idea of this attack is really right now. No, I'm kind of snookered on that one. So I go ahead and take the rook. White recaptures with his own rook, and now I move my knight out of the way. I'm feeling less threatened now at my end of the board. The knight is now attacking the queen, so white's going to have to use a move to move the queen. Goes check. Obviously I'll just put the rook in the way, which means that white is going to have to move his queen again. And white now comes in to try and force the exchange of queens. I've decided at this point that I've got a better chance of winning this game with the queens on the board, and the main reason for that is this fellow, the pawn on g3. It's effectively a passed pawn. There are no pawns anywhere around in front of it, so it could have a clear run and to queen here up at g8. I do still have a rook on the board and a knight on the board, but I figured that, you know, if I'm going to have a chance in this game, then I'd rather keep my queen. He comes in, tries to kick me away successfully. I move the queen back to e6 again. Remember, still then eyeing up this loose pawn here on a2. White moves the rook behind the queen, which is not particularly effective because the queen can't come into here. It'll just get captured, and then my knight can jump and defend my king. So I take the opportunity to go in and grab the loose pawn. Black is still actually one pawn up, if you see. So this pawn is his advantage in material as well as strategically. White responds sensibly by moving the king out of the way. There's no real way that he would be able to defend the b2 pawn. I don't think, so he thinks better of it, lives to fight another day. I snatch the b2. Rook comes in, defended by the knight, to defend c2. And I move my queen back. So one idea here is to now move this rook to f7, because the rook is now defended by the queen, and that queen is now skewered, which means, in fact, no, it's pinned. So it's a pin, it's an absolute pin. The queen cannot move. It cannot move legally, because if she moves onto any other square, the king would be in check, and that's an illegal move. Okay. Does my opponent spot this? Of course he does. And then decides to move his king out of the way. I then move my rook to that square instead of my queen, then getting another tempo, which means that I've gained time. I'm making my opponent, I'm forcing him to make a limited selection of moves. Right? Moves his queen a little out of the way. That's maybe not the ideal place for that queen to be, because if you think about it, it's now surrounded by pawns, and that is severely cramping the range of squares where that queen can go. So in terms of free squares, let's have a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 8 squares in total, but several of them are guarded already. So in reality, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, in fact, safe squares for that queen now to jump to. Whereas my queen has this whole, all 7 squares on there, and another, well, I can't go, and another one there. So I've got twice as much opportunity to move around the board that his queen has. So I decide to bring my queen in. So I'm kind of bringing my forces together now, so that I can be more comfortable that things are defended. I haven't got loose pieces around the board. White moves his rook around. I now bring my queen in with ideas. Maybe if this rook moves, I can move my queen into f1, which would be a big problem for that king. He doesn't move the rook. Instead, he just pushes a pawn forward. Now what I figure is, if I can grab this pawn. I can grab this pawn here on d3 with a knight, because the queen is defending this square and this square from my queen, right? And I figure that if my knight comes in and the queen takes the knight, my queen can jump in to f2, maybe then rook to f3, and I'm in a very strong position. So white chooses correctly not to capture the knight. So at this point in time, I've gone from being 2 pawns down to 1 pawn up. We've both got 1.5 minutes left on the clock, so it's been pretty even so far. I decided to bring my queen into f2 anyway, seeing as it's defended by the knight and the rook. So does white go for the exchange? He does indeed. My rook then comes in, and that is a fork. All right, so the rook's attacking the king and the knight. The king has 3 legal squares to move to, which means that wherever he moves, I'm going to be able to grab the knight. And that is looking now very, very good position. White then decides just to throw everything at a win. I think actually my best move here would have been, which I've noticed, I don't think this is what I play, would have been to move my knight there to f4. What that does is it prevents this pawn coming to g6, and also my rook then has the idea of coming to g2, making the king move out of the way and potentially also attacking this pawn as well. I didn't spot that in the game. I only had 1 minute 20 left. I decided to snatch the free pawn. Another thing this is doing in terms of thinking about your end game is that rooks are very, very good at blocking off whole areas of the board from the king. So this king now cannot progress down into my half of the board, so the king cannot effectively defend that pawn. He could try and attack the rook. He could try and come to f3 and attack the rook, but it's not too difficult for me to defend it by pushing a pawn, etc. So let's see what white does. Carries on with the idea of the of queening. I go in for a check. No reason why not to. Make white think. Now what I would love to do here would be to move my rook across and attack that king on the g-file. There's no way of me doing that. He could just, grab it. So, but I spot after. So I looked at this for 12 seconds. So I've got 1 minute 20 left on the clock. But it's one of those situations. There are times in the game where I say you need to use your time a lot. You use the time that you have, but within that as well, there are some situations that call for you really taking extra time, even if it's short on the clock. So I looked for 12 seconds. I spotted the fork on the king and the rook, and at that point white resigned, giving me not only my highest ever competitor that I've played against, but my highest ever win in blitz. So let's see how it would have panned out. Clearly white has to move the king. Yeah, well, he's resigned anyway, so it won't let me play it. I would then go ahead and take the rook, and with my knight there's nothing to stop my rook from coming here and skewering the king, so that if the king's still on the g-file, king has to move out of the way. I can then take it, giving up my rook for that dangerous pawn. But then look at the situation. I've got a king with 4 pawns and a knight, right? And all I have to do is get one of those pawns to the other end of the board, and white really has no chance. So he took 3 seconds on that and resigned. So huge result for me. Which has been good because my rating's down at 1269. It has been like 1350 or so not so long ago, so it's been on a bit of a slide, but this was a very useful result, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at the game as well.